Good evening, and welcome to the March edition of Flair's virtual programs. Tonight's program is Visiting the Madisons, What Guests Saw at Montpelier. I'm Diana Carlin, the president of Flair, First Ladies Association for Research and Education. And for those of you who are not familiar with Flair, our mission is to create and sustain a network to promote and publicize research and education relevant to the contributions, lives, impacts, and lasting legacies of U.S. First Ladies. And one of the ways we do that is through public programming like this one. So there are many people that I need to acknowledge tonight, and you're going to meet two of them in a little bit. But I really want to give some credit to Sharon Leahy and Abby Blackheart, who are back behind the scenes, backstage, who are making this program run smoothly. We also want at this point to acknowledge our institutional partners. Flair has members, and some of our strongest members are institutional partners. And Montpelier is one of those institutional partners. And we've been taking advantage of them to do programs like this one to give you a guided tour of some of those First Lady sites throughout the country and archives so that if you can't leave where you are, you can at least get around the country and learn a little bit more about these First Ladies. So one other thing I want to put on your calendar is May 15th at American University, starting at 8:30 until 5. Flair will be hosting a conference that is part of America 250 celebration, and we're partnering with American University School of Public Affairs First Ladies Institute, which Anita McBride, one of our founding members, heads. And so go to our website, flair-net.org, and you can find how to register for the conference, and we hope that you can attend. So what I'd like to do right now is introduce Flair's Vice President, Dr. Christopher Leahy, who's going to be introducing Hilarie Hicks, our guest, and he'll be moderating tonight's program. So join me in doing a wonderful tour of Montpelier, which I got to visit a year ago with Nancy Keegan-Smith, our immediate past president. We were the speakers for the Dolley Madison luncheon event. And I have to point out this beautiful Anhan dogwood with necklace, which they gave us. And if you like it, you can actually get that through Montpelier. So I'm going to turn this over to Chris, and I'm looking forward to returning to Montpelier.
Thank you, Diana. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce Hilarie M. Hicks. She is currently the senior research historian at James Madison's Montpelier, where she has been on staff since 2010. She contributed research for furnishing the old library and Nellie's Best Room, served on the research and writing team for the award-winning exhibition, The Mere Distinction of Color, and is currently the project director for an upcoming exhibition on James Madison and freedom of conscience. Hilarie writes biographies of the enslaved for the Naming Project on Montpelier's Digital Doorway website and has contributed to the site's blog on a wide variety of Madisonian topics. She is an alum of the College of William and Mary, where she earned her BA, the Cooperstown Graduate Program in History and Museum Studies, where she earned her MA, and the Seminar for Historical Administration. Please welcome Hilarie M. Hicks.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's a treat to see Diana again after being her staff host at our Dolley Madison Legacy Luncheon. Now, the long title of my talk, which didn't fit on the original slide, they are seldom alone, but have a great succession of visitors. So this is what visitors remembered about James and Dolley and Montpelier. So you and I might not drop in on the Bushes if we went to Crawford, Texas, or the Clintons if we passed through Chappaqua, New York. Next slide. But in the Madisons' day, travelers felt no hesitation about coming to see Dolley and James Madison at Montpelier. As their friend Margaret Baird Smith noted, the Madisons were seldom alone, but had a great succession of visitors. Next slide. Or as Dolley put it one day in May 1835, she had a house full of company, relations, connections, neighbors, and strangers. Sometimes these visitors were family and neighbors within a short ride of Montpelier. Sometimes the visitors were old friends from Washington or Philadelphia. Sometimes they were people who showed up with letters of introduction, And sometimes they were people who just showed up. Through our research, we've identified over 300 people who visited Montpelier. Now, some visitors were more fun than others, as Madison told Harriet Martineau. Madison described to her with much vivacity the variety of visits from strangers that he was subject to, saying that some were taxes and others bounties. But for research, we can stay on that slide, that's okay. For research, every visitor who wrote an account is a bounty. It could be a diary entry written to preserve the traveler's experience in their own mind. It could be a letter written to share with a loved one, or an account written specifically for publication. Sometimes it's just a line, I went to Montpelier. Other accounts include descriptions of the Madisons, the house, the grounds, a meal, a conversation, in varying detail. Those who visited soon after Madison retired from the presidency in 1817 met the Madisons in middle age and got a full tour of the plantation. Those who visited in the 1830s might not see much beyond the elderly James Madison's room. Tonight, I'll highlight about a dozen or so visitor accounts in chronological order, looking at who these visitors were and what's significant about each account. And you'll be able to see from the photos how we've used visitor accounts to help us make decisions in furnishing the Montpelier house. Next slide. In case you haven't had the opportunity to visit Montpelier yourself, it's a plantation located in Orange County, Virginia, in the Piedmont area of central Virginia, near the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was owned by 3 generations of the Madison family, starting with President Madison's grandfather. At its height, the plantation was close to 5,000 acres. Enslaved laborers raised tobacco and wheat for sale, which was the source of the Madisons' income. Today, Montpelier is about 2,700 acres. The property, the property is owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and it's co-stewarded by the Montpelier Foundation. We've restored the house to its appearance when James and Dolley Madison lived there after his retirement from the presidency from 1817 until his death in 1836. So let's let the Madisons' visitors from the 19th century tell us about their impressions of Montpelier. Next slide. We'll start with the Baron de Montlezun, who visited while Madison was president. There's no known portrait of him, so we'll just imagine that he's among these French soldiers at the Battle of Yorktown, since he participated in that battle the first time that he came to America. Montlezun returned to America in 1816, 1817, and visited Montpelier in September of 1816. In his published account, Montlezun describes his activities during the visit. He sketches personalities of family members and observes features on the plantation, including a flock of merino sheep and a wheat threshing machine. Montlezun writes, "Shortly after my arrival, I had the honor of seeing Mr. Madison, to whom I presented some letters of introduction, thanks to which I was received with the most polished courtesy and invited to spend several days with him. Since the president does not speak French with ease, I had to express myself in his language." Next slide. His stepson, who had just returned from Europe, where he had been traveling, and not without profit, was with him. He speaks French very well indeed, and seems well educated. He is a young man of fine physique, with perfect manners. Gentility is stamped on his face. And this is a portrait of Dolley's son, John Payne Todd, attributed to Joseph Wood, and painted about 1817, so not too long after Montlezun's visit. Next slide. Montlezun continued, "Mrs. Madison entered a little later. I had the honor of being presented to her. Mrs. Madison is a handsome woman, although she has passed her prime. Now keep in mind, Dolley was 48 years old, a year younger than when James Wood painted this portrait, so I'm not quite sure she had passed her prime yet. Her face possesses a certain air of nobleness. Her bearing is gracious, and her manner of speech betokens gentleness. I had to converse in English with Mrs. Madison also. Next slide. The president, although he is cold and reserved, is most polite and affable. He is still hale and vigorous and enjoys perfect health. So Madison was 65 when Montlezun visited, 1 year before James Wood painted this portrait. Next slide. After a short conversation, I was shown to an apartment from which the view looks over a plain bounded by the Blue Mountains. From my apartment, and particularly from the terrace which is attached to it, I can glimpse over the tops of the forest an immense plain whose fertile terrain, strewn here and there with hillocks, gradually lifts its successive levels, variously tinted, up to the romantic and misty masses which outline their semicircular amphitheater against the horizon. So we know Montlezun was talking about this room because it's the only upstairs room at Montpelier that has both a mountain view and access to one of the roof terraces. So if you were sitting in that armchair, you'd be looking at the door to the terrace. Next slide. Montlezun continues. At 2 o'clock, several ladies and gentlemen arrived by carriage and on horseback. Mrs. Madison, the mother of the president, came down to meet them. She is 86 years old and enjoys perfect health. Her memory is good. She is still a very active woman and busies herself with the different occupations of her sex, as in the flower of her youth. I chatted with her about the War of Independence and General Cornwallis. He instilled a great deal of terror, she told me. This is a bas-relief of Nellie Madison that was carved by Pietro Cardelli in 1819, 3 years after Montlezun's visit. Next slide. He continues, Sunday offered its usual dreariness. Since the coolness and the humidity were beginning to be felt after some very warm days, a small fire lighted in the drawing room made us very comfortable. Reading, dining, conversation, and even chess, in spite of the sanctity of the day and the power of custom, drove away boredom and led us agreeably to the hour of retirement and delusive dreams. Next slide. We'll leave Montlezun to his dreams, and now we'll hear from James Kirk Paulding about his visit. Paulding was a writer and the brother-in-law of Washington Irving. He visited Montpelier in the summer of 1818. Next slide. This comes from a biographical sketch of Madison that Paulding wrote around 1845, so he's reflecting back. He writes, Our daily routine, with little variation except Sundays, was as follows. After breakfast, between 7 and 8, I took my cigar and seated myself on the western portico, looking towards the Blue Ridge, while Mr. Madison would commence a conversation, sometimes on public affairs, in connection with his previous public life, sometimes on literary and philosophical subjects, and not infrequently, for he was a capital storyteller, he would relate anecdotes highly amusing as well as interesting. He was a man of wit, relished wit in others, and his small bright blue eyes would twinkle most wickedly when lighted up by some whimsical conception or exposition. By and by, the horses were brought, and we set out on a tour to visit the different parts of the estate where farming operations were going on. So that's a day in the life of a Montpelier visitor. Next slide. Our next visitor is George Ticknor, who visited in December 1824 at age 33, so picture him about 7 years younger than when he sat for this Thomas Sully portrait in 1831. Ticknor was a professor of languages at Harvard, and he traveled to Montpelier with his wife and Daniel Webster. And this is how Ticknor described his visit in a letter written soon afterward. We were received with a good deal of dignity and much cordiality by Mr. and Mrs. Madison on the portico, and immediately placed at ease, for they were apprised of our coming an hour or two before we arrived, and were therefore all in order. Mr. Madison is a younger-looking man, he is now 74, than he was when I saw him 10 years ago, with an unsuccessful war grinding him to the earth. Next slide. He lives apparently with great regularity. We breakfasted at 9, dined about 4, drank tea at 7, and went to bed at 10. That is, we went to our rooms, where we were furnished with everything we wanted, and where Mrs. Madison sent us a nice supper every night and a nice luncheon every forenoon. I don't know how they fit that in with all the other meals. From 10 o'clock in the morning till 3, we rode, walked, or remained in our rooms, Mr. and Mrs. Madison being then occupied. The table was very ample and elegant, and somewhat luxurious. It is evidently a serious item in the account of Mr. Madison's happiness, and it seems to be his habit to pass about an hour after the cloth is removed with a variety of wines of no mean quality. On Sunday forenoon, we took a ride of several dozen miles across different plantations to see the country and the people. Mr. Madison's farm, as he calls it, consists of about 3,000 acres with 180 slaves and is among the best managed in Virginia. Now, this is the only account where the Madisons leave their guests to their own devices for 5 hours at a time. I don't know whether they left these particular visitors on their own for an unusually long stretch, or if it's just that with other visitors, even if they were sometimes left alone, they tended to write more about the time they spent with the Madisons. Next slide. And now we'll visit with the delightful Mrs. Margaret Baird Smith. She was a fascinating woman. She wrote newspaper articles and novels and children's books. Her letters and journals were published after her death, and they provide a great deal of insight into Washington society and politics from about 1800 to 1844. Margaret Baird Smith knew the Madisons in Washington, D.C. before visiting them at Montpelier in August 1809 and then again in August 1828. And she described the 1828 visit in a letter to her sister. Being a professional writer, she wrote very detailed descriptions, and then she later incorporated them into a biographical essay on Dolley Madison that she wrote for a book called The National Portrait Gallery. So Margaret wrote, "We drove to the door. Mr. M met us in the portico and gave us a cordial welcome. In the hall, Mrs. Madison received me with open arms and that overflowing kindness and affection which seems a part of her nature." Next slide. We were at first conducted into the drawing room. The drawing room walls are covered with pictures, some very fine, from the ancient masters, but most of them portraits of our most distinguished men, 6 or 8 by Stuart. The mantelpiece, tables in each corner, and in fact wherever one could be fixed, were filled with busts and groups of figures in plaster, so that this apartment had more the appearance of a museum of the arts than a drawing room. It was a charming room, giving activity to the mind by the historic and classic ideas that it awakened. Next slide. Mrs. M then carried us into her own chamber. It was very large and commodious, and furnished with every convenience and much elegance. Before a large sofa lay her work. Couches, easy chairs, etc., invited us to ease and comfortable indulgence. I told her I had no notion of playing lady visitor all day and sitting prim in the drawing room with our hands before us, and if she would resume her seat and her work, we would sit with her and work too. So agreed. She drew Anna, that's Margaret's daughter, she drew Anna on the sofa beside her and gave her half a dozen pretty books to look over. While drawing a French armchair or fauteuil, what charming things they are, close by her, I reclined at my ease while we talked. Next slide. I could scarcely credit my senses when dinner was announced, and I found it to be 4 o'clock. So rapidly had the morning passed away. We did not rise from table until 6 o'clock. Mr. Madison was chief speaker, and his conversation was a stream of history, and continued so until 10 o'clock, when we separated for the night. So rich in sentiments and facts, so enlivened by anecdotes and epigrammatic remarks, so frank and confidential as to opinions on men and measures, that it had an interest and charm which the conversation of few men now living could have. He spoke of scenes in which he himself had acted a conspicuous part, and of great men who had been actors in the same theater. No commonplaces. Every sentence he spoke was worthy of being written down. The formation and adoption of the Constitution, the Convention and First Congress, the characters of their members and the secret debates. Franklin, Washington, Hamilton, John Adams, Jefferson, Jay, Patrick Henry, and a host of other great men were spoken of, and characteristic anecdotes of all related. It was living history. I just love Margaret's description of Madison's storytelling as living history. I think that's why so many people wanted to visit Montpelier in the 19th century, to have that living link with history, and why so many people still visit today. Next slide. Our next visitor is John H.B. Latrobe. You see him in this portrait by William B. West at age 37 in 1840, so that's about 8 years after he visited Montpelier. The Madisons knew John Latrobe's parents well. Benjamin Latrobe was the architect who had helped Dolley furnish the president's house. And Dolley had known Mary Hazelhurst Latrobe even longer, since they were girls in Philadelphia. John Latrobe described his August 1832 visit in a letter. This is the first 1830s account we've looked at tonight, and the first where we see Madison spending most of his time in the room adjoining the dining room, as his health trended downward. Next slide. As Latrobe recalled, I handed my letter from my mother to Mrs. Madison to the servant, and was shown into the drawing room. The walls are covered with paintings, save where 2 immense mirrors on the side at which you enter conceal large portions. Here are Stuart's portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Madison, and one of his very best of Jefferson. Also a copy by him of his original portrait of Washington, a very good head of the elder Adams by Trumbull, and numerous paintings, some quite large, procured by Payne Todd while he was in Europe. These are not generally good. Numerous small busts in terracotta of distinguished men are upon the mantelpiece, and along the cornice of the principal door into the apartment. A piano is in one recess. An electrical machine occupies a corner. So you can see some similarities to Margaret Baird Smith's description of the drawing room, even if their assessment of the artworks is a little different. Next slide, please. Latrobe continues, to the right is a very broad passage, wainscoted and hung so as to conceal the walls very nearly, with paintings of various merits and demerits. Mrs. Madison entered the room. Upon my inquiring after Mr. Madison's health, she told me he had that day for the first time in 12 months, ridden out. Soon after, she led the way to the room which he occupies in the eastern wing of the building. Mr. Madison was lying on a French bed supported by pillows, a white cap drawn down to his eyebrows, and a white flannel dressing gown wrapped around his attenuated form. Mrs. Madison mentioned my name, and extending his hand to me, he gave warm and welcome greeting in a voice whose clearness, strength, and steadiness astonished me. I seated myself on a chair at his bedside. Dinner time arrived long before I expected it. Dinner was served in a room adjoining Mr. Madison's in very handsome style. Mrs. Madison, J. Payne Todd, her son, a niece of hers, a child quite, and myself sitting down to it. Rarely had I drunk finer wine. Next slide. After dinner, Mr. Madison, who sees the table from where he lies, called me to him, and the conversation, which dinner interrupted, was resumed and continued until 9:30. I made several movements to leave his bedside, saying I feared he fatigued himself, but he would not hear of it, replying that his lungs were the strongest part of him that was left, and I continued with him, therefore, until his usual hour of retiring for the night. Now, the yellow door that you see on the left side of this photo is the door leading to the dining room. So you can see how Madison was able to enjoy the dinner table conversation even when he didn't feel up to sitting at the table. Next slide. Next, we have Dr. George Shattuck, whom you see here as an older man, but he was only 22 when he visited Montpelier in January 1835 and wrote about it in his diary. Next slide. Shattuck began with his approach to Montpelier. You now pass through a gate into a large field, and just before you is the house of Mr. Madison. A slat fence, painted black, with white posts surrounds the house at quite a respectful distance, curving in front. There were 3 yellow doors. The middle one opens into an entry. A servant came out and showed me to the left-hand door and into a parlor, the door of which opened on the left. I gave him my letter and took a seat. Now, Shattuck is referring to the room as a parlor, but we can tell from his location that he was actually in the dining room. Next slide. Shattuck continues, a servant came in, and I was shown into the bedroom, which is just on the east side of the house. The venerable ex-president was seated in an armchair, his back supported by a pillow. In person, he is quite small and emaciated. Mrs. M. was sitting in the room. I sat about an hour and then rose up to go, but they invited me to stay and dine with them, and I accepted the invitation and sat down again. He spoke of Washington and the proceedings there. Mr. M. dined in his room, and he breakfasts in bed. A niece of Mrs. M.'s was at table with us. There was before us soup, a roast turkey, boiled beef, chicken pie, potatoes fried with grease, turnips, then cranberry pie, custards, preserves. There was toddy offered before dinner and wine. After dinner, Mrs. M. took me to see a painting of Mr. M. by Stuart, which she considers the best. Mrs. Madison now took me to the back part of the house and showed me the lawn. To the south of the lawn is the garden, in which Mrs. Madison told me that she took great interest. I sat down again in Mr. M.'s room after dinner. The room was quite long, the furniture old. The bedstead was of wood painted white. There was a canopy high over the center of the bed, to which the curtains ran up, converging. I rose about 5 o'clock and shook hands once more with Mr. M. Mrs. M said something to me about passing the night, but I could not. Next slide. Another visitor who mainly saw Madison in his room next to the dining room was Harriet Martineau, a British abolitionist and social theorist. Richard Evans painted this portrait of her about 1834, not too long before she came to Montpelier in February 1835. Dolley wrote to her niece, Mary Cutts, quote, "How much we were pleased with her enlightened conversation and unassuming manners." Martineau traveled in the U.S. from 1834 to 1836, and she included this description of Montpelier in her travelogue, which was called Retrospect of Western Travel. She writes, "While I was at Washington, I received a kind invitation from Mr. and Mrs. Madison to visit them at their seat, Montpelier, Virginia. We were warmly welcomed by Mrs. Madison and a niece. I was conducted to the apartment of Mr. Madison. During this winter, he confined himself to one room, rising after breakfast before 9 o'clock, and sitting in his easy chair till 10 at night. He appeared perfectly well during my visit, and was a wonderful man of 83. He complained of one ear being deaf, and that his sight, which had never been perfect, prevented his reading much. But I did not perceive that he lost any part of the conversation." Next slide. "He was in his chair with a pillow behind him when I first saw him, his little person wrapped in a black silk gown, a warm gray and white cap upon his head, which his lady took care should always sit becomingly, and gray worsted gloves, his hands having been rheumatic. His voice was clear and strong, and his manner of speaking particularly lively, often playful. He seemed not to have lost any teeth, and the form of the face was therefore preserved, without any striking marks of age. His relish for conversation could never have been keener. I was in perpetual fear of his becoming exhausted, and at the end of every few hours, I left my seat by the arm of his chair and went to the sofa by Mrs. Madison on the other side of the room. But he was sure to follow and sit down between us, so that when I found the only effect of my moving was to deprive him of the comfort of his chair, I returned to my station." Next slide. Mrs. M is celebrated throughout the country for the grace and dignity with which she discharged the arduous duties which devolve upon the President's lady. For a term of 8 years, she administered the hospitalities of the White House with such discretion, impartiality, and kindness that it is believed she gratified everyone and offended nobody. She is a strong-minded woman, fully capable of entering into her husband's occupations and cares, and there is little doubt that he owed much to her intellectual companionship, as well as to her ability in sustaining the outward dignity of his office. The next morning, Harriet writes, we can stay on the same slide. The next morning, Harriet writes, "The active old man, who declared himself crippled with rheumatism, had breakfasted, risen, and was dressed before we sat down to breakfast. He talked a good deal about the American presidents and some living politicians for 2 hours, when his letters and newspapers were brought in. He gaily threw them aside, saying that he could read the newspapers every day and must make the most of his time with us. During all our conversations, one or another slave was perpetually coming to Mrs. Madison for the great bunch of keys. 2 or 3 more lounged about in the room, leaning against the doorposts or the corner of the sofa, and the attendance of others was no less indefatigable in my own apartment. So as an abolitionist, Martineau may have taken more notice of the enslaved domestic workers than some other visitors who perhaps took their presence for granted. But I think it's so interesting that she notes them always coming to Dolley for that great bunch of keys. Next slide. Our next visitor, Septimia Randolph Mickleham, is someone you might not immediately recognize, but you undoubtedly know her grandfather, Thomas Jefferson. Septimia was the seventh daughter of Martha Jefferson Randolph, hence the name. She was born in 1814, and she accompanied her mother on many visits to Montpelier when she was young. And she later wrote an unpublished sketch about, quote, the quiet home life of Mr. and Mrs. Madison. Next slide. So here is an excerpt from Quiet Home Life. My mother generally carried me with her when she visited Mrs. Madison, and young as I was, those visits were a great treat. Mr. Madison's library opened out of the dining room, so we're now in this photo looking through that same doorway, but in the opposite direction. So we're in the dining room looking into Mr. Madison's room. Septimia says, Mrs. Madison was generally with or near her husband. When we were at Montpelier, my mother would leave Mrs. Madison during the morning hours to her household duties. When those were over, the two ladies sat in the dining room to be near Mr. Madison, who rarely, if ever, joined in, although the door was open. Had I been old enough to remember all I heard from the two friends, it would fill a book. Their reminiscences of the days when they were in Washington were full of instruction and most amusing incident. I have seen them laugh till the tears ran down their cheeks at the scenes they had participated in and been lookers-on of. At 12 o'clock, snack was served and was profuse, as were all the meals at Montpelier. The table was long enough to accommodate a dozen persons, and full of all that a fine Virginia farm could supply. Next slide. Half an hour before dinner, we assembled in the drawing room, where after the old Virginia custom, wine and cake were handed to give an appetite for the dinner. After that meal, Mr. Madison sat with us, or we strolled about, listening to his interesting conversation. Next slide. Our next visitor was the same age as Septimia Randolph Mickleham, Dolley's niece, Mary E. Cutts. And like Septimia, Mary had vivid memories of childhood visits to Montpelier, which she incorporated into a memoir that she wrote of Dolley. Now, we have no portrait of Mary Cutts, but there is a portrait of Dolley by Mary Cutts shown on the front cover of the memoir. The Mary Cutts memoir was published posthumously, so despite what the sticker says, my copy was not signed by Mary herself. It was signed by the editor of the modern edition. Now, the Cutts memoir is not perfectly accurate, but it is worth examining for Mary's unique perspective and access to family lore. Next slide. Mary describes several rooms in the house, beginning with the wing occupied by James Madison's mother, Nellie Conway Madison. And Mary Cutts writes, Mrs. Madison Sr., or the old lady, as she was usually called, kept up the primitive hours for meals, to which she had become accustomed, and her time for receiving visits from the guests of her son was after her dinner and before his. They esteemed it a privilege to be taken at 2 o'clock, her audience hour, from the pictured hall and mirrored walls to the old-time wainscoted and closeted rooms of this most excellent woman. Her usual seat was on a couch in the center of a large room, a table in front, on which was her Bible, prayer book, and knitting. Next slide. We must not dwell too long on these familiar scenes, but mount the carved staircase in the old lady's part of the household and enter the library. Plain cases, not only round the room, but in the middle, with just sufficient room to pass between. These cases were well filled with books, papers, pamphlets, everything of interest to our country before and since the Revolution. This is no exaggeration. And we've done our best to recreate the old library with cases and cases of books, but we did have to leave some room in the middle of the room for tour groups to stand. Next slide. Our next visitor is former Congressman Charles Jared Ingersoll, and he was one of the last people to visit Montpelier while James Madison was still living in May of 1836. When Madison died a few weeks later, Ingersoll decided to publish his account of the visit. And he wrote, "I had long promised myself a visit to Mr. Madison, whom I had not seen for 20-odd years. We got there before breakfast and were most hospitably received." Next slide. The house is in good design, but decayed, and in need of inconsiderable repairs, which at a trifling expense would make a great difference in favor of the first impression of his residence. The table, not only abundantly but handsomely provided, good soups, flesh, fish, and vegetables, well-cooked dessert, and excellent wines of various kinds. Mrs. Madison rises early, is very active, but seldom leaves the house, as her devotion to Mr. Madison is incessant, and he needs all her constant attention. Next slide. Soon after our arrival, Mrs. Madison took us into the room he occupies during the day, and from that time, I passed the greater part of 3 days at his side, listening to his conversation. He cannot sit up, except a little while, now and then to rest from reclining on a sofa. We found him more unwell than usual, and with a difficulty of breathing, which affects his speech, so that Mrs. Madison told me I must talk and not let him. But as I wanted to listen, and he appeared to grow better every day, our conversation animated without fatiguing him. Infirm as his body is, his understanding is as bright as ever. He loves to talk freely on all subjects of political and historical interest, which do not involve the mere politics of the day. Next slide. Several times, on my expressing hopes of his health improving, he said, with perfect composure and resignation, that he believed he had a proper sense of his situation, that he felt he was on the descending, not the ascending line. And as it turned out, Madison was correct. He died on June the 28th, 1836, just a month after Ingersoll's visit. Next slide. I'll finish up with one post-Madison visitor, George W. Bagby, who was a journalist and humorist who came to Montpelier in 1871, when it was owned by Frank Carson. Bagby visited the family cemetery and took a path that caused him to approach the Montpelier house from the rear lawn. Next slide. Bagby observed that, quote, "The rear lawn, level as a floor, carpeted thick with greensward and surrounded by tall trees of various foliage and beautiful forms, bursts upon you with a truly scenic effect." Mr. Carson, a whole-souled Irishman who now owns the place, soon made his appearance. He hurried me to the door opening upon the front portico. Then I must see the gigantic chestnut trees, then to the garden, where we feasted on grapes, pears, and figs. Next slide. And then back to the portico to see the sun go down in glory behind the purple battlements of the ridge, the sky all amber and orange, and the landscape fading, melting, glooming down through all the tints of the spectrum. Now, this fabulous photo was taken by our former Director of Historic Preservation in January 2016. And the first time I saw the photo, the Bagby quote just popped right into my mind, because it was as if I was seeing the same sunset that he had seen in 1871. And to me, that's what's so exciting about visitor accounts. These visitors were walking through the same spaces that we get to walk through every day, but most of them did it while the Madisons were still here. And the words of these past visitors help us to visualize Montpelier as the Madisons knew it, to recreate the setting by restoring and refurnishing the house, and to share it with today's visitors, giving them some unique insights into the daily lives of the Madisons and the enslaved community. And I hope you will all become Montpelier visitors yourselves one day, maybe even during this significant year of America 250. So thank you very much. And I think we have some time now that we can do some questions.
Yes, Hilarie, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm particularly struck by the cross section of Americans and even non-Americans that came to Montpelier. I'm wondering, are there any other visitors that you could not include in the presentation that you found particularly interesting?
Yeah, I mean, we've identified over 300 people who came to Montpelier, and not all of them left as detailed descriptions, but there are certainly other ones. I'm trying to think if there's anybody off the top of my head. One person that I did not include was Sir John Augustus Foster, who was a British diplomat. And he doesn't give us as much description of the inside of the house, but he's really good with talking about the layout of the plantation and some of the activities of the enslaved people, and particularly all the different trades that were practiced at Montpelier, because as he said, when you're so far out from a town, the plantation had to be able to do a lot of things for itself.
Yeah, I'm wondering, did William Cabell Reeves visit Montpelier? Yeah, okay.
Yes, and his wife Judith wrote about it, and she talked about a time when there were figs in the garden, and there was a particular tree that William Cabell Reeves wanted to get some fruit from. And she had a great way of phrasing it that I can't quite pull up at the moment, but essentially he took a tumble down one of the steep terraces trying to get at this fruit.
Well, I'm glad. For my dissertation, I had to go through the William Cabell Reeves papers, and I was cursing him. So that sort of seems like just desserts, in my view, anyway. Daniel Webster, you mentioned Webster coming with George Ticknor in 1824. And Webster, if I'm not mistaken, actually stayed longer than he was initially supposed to. I'm wondering, did the Madisons ever write, or anybody write about how they couldn't get rid of certain guests?
I don't recall them saying that exactly, but I do recall one letter that there were a couple of guests who hadn't yet arrived, and Dolley was writing to her sister and kind of fretting about the fact that the Barlows hadn't shown up yet. And now it was getting to be pickling and preserving time, and she was kind of hoping they didn't show up because she knew she was going to be really busy in the next week or two.
Okay, but nobody that kind of went with the Benjamin Franklin adage about fish smelling after a few days and visitors smelling after a few days. Nobody that comes to mind in that regard?
No, not in that regard, although Madison did make that kind of veiled comment about some people being taxes and others bounties. So there must have been some people that he found taxing.
Okay, all right. Well, that's good to know. You had mentioned, I think it was Mr. Shattuck who came, and he had mentioned the 3 yellow doors. And I'm wondering if there was a significance to the color yellow.
Oh, I thought you were going to say to the 3 doors. I don't think there's a significance to the color yellow. There's some speculation that could have been an undercoat that was intended to have wood graining done over it. We don't know that for sure. But the fact that there were 3 doors had to do with the way the house had grown over time. So actually the door on the far right was the original front door for the smaller house that Madison's father built. And then the section to the left was added when James and Dolley got married and came back to Montpelier. So there were 2 houses two households under one roof. And then when Madison added the outer wings prior to his retirement. He reconfigured the interior and added the center door.
Okay. In her wonderful biography of Dolley Madison, Catherine Auger writes that at Montpelier, Dolley ceased to be larger than life. Is that the impression that you have, that, you know, she was larger than life as First Lady, and she's larger than life when she moves back to Washington? You know, a lot of other First Ladies and surrogate First Ladies relied on her for advice, but do you get a sense that she felt more at home and that made her less of a, you know, of a presence?
Well, I wouldn't say less of a presence. I would say it was maybe a calmer time in her life, and she was focused more on household duties and later caring for Madison and entertaining, but at a more relaxed scale. She says in one letter that she's more comfortable with entertaining 100 people at Montpelier than she was with 25 in the Washington, D.C. years.
Is that because she was on her own home turf, do you think, or you know, how do you account for that?
Home turf, and maybe not quite as high stakes. I mean, when in Washington, she was inviting people of different political parties, and I think it probably took a lot more energy to manage and to get everybody interacting in the right way and that sort of thing. And when she came back to Montpelier, most of the people that came were either friends or just interested acquaintances, interested visitors.
Yeah, I like the way you put that about the stakes being a little bit lower. That's definitely true, no doubt. I'm also wondering if any visitors commented on the state of Montpelier, state of disrepair. It needed new paint. You know, there were curtains that were threadbare. Is there any sense that you had that people were looking at what they saw at Montpelier and were critical or recognized that there needed to be home improvements made?
Just at the very, very end. So like the last visitor I mentioned, Charles Jared Ingersoll, said something to the effect of there were different little things that could have been done at a small expense that would have brightened things up quite a bit.
Okay. And what relationship does your research have to various archives that hold collections of people who visited Madison? And how far out or how much of an extension do you have in terms of your research to try to get at the visitors to Montpelier?
Well, we are very fortunate that over the years, we have developed a research database that has over 35,000 sources in it. And so we started out by mining the obvious sources. So we were doing papers of James Madison, papers of Dolley Madison, the big collections, Library of Congress. But over time, we have reached out to different repositories that we become aware of that, for example, George Shattuck actually wrote 2 different accounts, a letter and a diary, and we're able to reach out and find his papers and access that diary.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Again, I really enjoyed it. I think there's many more questions that I could ask, but we are going to turn it back to our president, Diana Carlin, to conclude tonight's program.
Well, Hilarie and Christopher, thank you. Your conversation here was great. And what a wonderful program. It brought back memories from my visit with you a year ago. You're a great tour guide. And the photos were fantastic. The restoration work that's been done is exceptional. And I really do encourage people, if you're anywhere in the area, to visit Montpelier and hear these stories. Hilarie had mentioned America 250. And one of the things that we're trying to do with our Flair programming this year is cover the breadth of that 250 years by looking at first ladies from across that time, that entire time period. So Dolley got us into the early years and the wives of our founders. And our very first January program, and I encourage everybody to go to our website, flair-net.org. And in the lower right-hand corner, there are icons, and there is a little television icon. That's our YouTube channel, and you can see every single program that we've done. But Andy Oakes, the First Lady's man, really highlighted a lot of the First Lady sites that he visited in January. And then in February, we had a tour of Edith Wilson's home, also in Virginia. So there's a lot of history in Virginia. If you go to Virginia, you're going to be able to cover a lot of territory. So please like and subscribe to our Facebook and YouTube pages, and those are here. And then also, this is on June 21st, we will celebrate the 5th anniversary of Flair. And so during our 5th anniversary year of 2026, we are really encouraging people to help us continue to do the outreach that we're doing and tell these stories by Give Me Five. So we have a Give Me Five campaign. What we'd like for you to do, if you really like our programming, if you like what we're doing, make a contribution in any amount that has the number 5 in it. Whether it's $5 or $500 or anything in between, we will be happy. But we're really hoping, that if people like what we're doing, that they'll continue to support it, because all of these programs are available to the public. And I also want to mention our partner program, which is American FLOTUS for First Lady of the United States. It is our podcast, and we will have a new podcast released on Thursday. The current one is on Barbara Bush, and all of those are also archived on our website, along with transcripts. So if some of you are researchers out there, all of our programs are transcripted for our podcast to make your research easier. And of course, anything that we have on our YouTube channel is, we just ask that you give Flair credit for it. So thank you again, Hilarie, for a delightful revisit for me to Montpelier. Chris, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. And once again, thanks to our people in the background, Sharon Leahy and Abby Bleichart, our intern from American University. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, and anyone who watches us in their own time. So good night, and we'll see you next month.